Hi, this is Roger in Finland, and today we're going to take a look at how the Panasonic G9 does in low light and high ISO. Well, in summary, for the impatient ones, ISO 12800, which is the highest ISO you can go with video in the Panasonic G9, it's unusable, and up to 6400 is usable given that you expose it well. If you expose it badly, even ISO 400 will look horrible. And now let's go into some more details. In general, and this is not a problem or a special feature of the Panasonic G9, when you have images which are underexposed, you're going to have problems with noise, especially in the shadows, obviously. And if they are really overexposed, you might have problems with color, meaning that you will be losing color information and color detail. What is the case in most cameras, and the Panasonic G9 is not an exception also, is that in lower ISOs or closer to the base ISO of the camera, you're going to have more dynamic range, which in practice means more room for error. And the higher the ISO, then the opposite is also true. There is less dynamic range, therefore there is less margin for error, and it is more important that you expose well. Just to try to keep this video short, I'm going to simplify some of the things I'll be talking about, and I will not show all the tests that I did. And if you're interested to know how the tests were done, I did set up the camera. It's using 4K, 25p, 422, 10-bit. It's being recorded into the Atomos Ninja 5 using the NHHQ. ISOs ranging from 400 to 12,800 and using a JLG profile. That's the reason for the minimum ISO 400. Then what I did was change a little bit the aperture of the lens. I think that most shots are between, let's say, f3.5 and f5.6, and mostly I was varying the intensity of the light. So what I did was expose the image so that the highlights, and that would be the bar on the left of this x-rite color chart, it's still not clipping, and then the middle gray, it's a little bit above the middle. That would be my base shot of where I'm calling properly exposed. HLG and log profiles like to be a little bit overexposed as long as you're not clipping. So that's why I'm pushing it a little bit to the higher, and that's where you're gonna get the best results. And then what I was doing was changing either the aperture in combination with intensity of the light to get the white at 25% of the full scale of exposure, 50, 75, then to the correct level, and then overexposed. And then also once I had the pure white overexposed, still kept on overexposing, so climbing the middle gray up to 75%. And that's where in ISO 400 you can recover something and get an image that looks somewhat decent, but ISO 6400 or 12,800 you lose all the color information. One important topic that I wanted to touch is that a little bit the confusion of mixing totally or just talking as if they are the same thing, low light and high ISO performance. Because sometimes when you shoot in low light, as in a dark scene, you want the scene to be dark. So you actually don't need to see in the dark. You're not wearing like night vision goggles. Some cameras are capable of that, most aren't. This one certainly isn't, but dark scenes can be dark. What is really important is how do you expose? Because people will say, high ISOs will have a lot of noise, try to avoid it and shoot with low ISOs. Well, it depends, because if you shoot with low ISO, but then you have to push it a lot in post, then you're gonna have troubles. And that's what we will be looking into in this video. So now let's take a look at some shots where I made on purpose the same mistakes. And that would be, both of them are underexposed in different ISO levels, and then I corrected them. For instance, this shot is shot in ISO 400, it's terribly underexposed, and then next to it we can see ISO 6400, and it's also terribly underexposed. You can see that both look not great, and I'm not sure if you would have such a low light scene that you would like it to see this dark, but there's strange stuff that goes on there. But now let's imagine that that was a mistake and you actually need to push those shadows up. Now let's take a look at both. They're both actually pretty horrible. So if they are really badly underexposed, even ISO 400 will introduce a ton of noise, and you really don't want that. You would have been much better off with a higher ISO, proper exposure, and you would have a much cleaner image, like this one. Now let's take a look at an overexposed image. Again, similar level of overexposure. Here, both had the white clipping and the middle gray about 75% exposure, but you can see that in ISO 400, when I correct that and bring the exposure down, colors are somewhat decently preserved. Then if you have an image which is slightly underexposed or slightly overexposed, then the problems are not as dramatic. And here is where lower ISOs have clearly an advantage over higher ISOs, and that is the margin of error and dynamic range we were talking before. When you push a little bit ISO 400 image, it looks very good. If you need to pull a little bit ISO 400, it still looks pretty good. If you need to push a little bit ISO 6400, then noise is quite present, and this is something that will be a lot better in ISO, let's say up to 1600. And then also when you need to pull down from an overexposed image, slightly overexposed image in ISO 6400, it looks quite all right, but some of the colors are starting to do a little bit different things. That maybe to illustrate this point even stronger, let's take a look at a properly exposed image in ISO 6400, and then let's compare it to a heavily underexposed image in ISO 400. And you can see that now that I need to correct this to bring the exposure in a similar levels so that their waveforms look somewhere in the similar range, you can see that actually ISO 6400 is way better looking than ISO 400. So the exposure was more important than ISO itself. The opposite is true as well. So now I have the properly exposed image in ISO 6400, and this is the terribly overexposed ISO 400. When I bring that one down, it's still decent because ISO 400 actually holds quite well if it's a little bit overexposed in HLG profile, but I still think that even ISO 6400 with this tiny little bit of noise looks better than the more manipulated, overexposed or badly exposed in general ISO 400 image. So in summary, we all knew that the Panasonic G9 does not see in the dark, but let's say that at 12,800 ISO, I would say that it's unusable. It has quite a lot of ugly looking noise, even when you expose it correctly. So I would say that, in my opinion, the highest you can go in the Panasonic G9 is ISO 6400 to get a decently and clean enough image if you're exposing well. And that's an important point. It is better to expose well with higher ISO levels if they give you a decent level of noise, as we just said, ISO 6400 being the max for the G9. That will be better than having a lower ISO but being badly exposed and having to push or pull in post. We've seen it. We've shown how ISO 400 can look awful compared to ISO 6400, for instance, but that happens to all the values. The lower the ISO, the more margin of error you have because you have more dynamic range. The higher the ISO, the more precise you need to be with your exposure. But I think you'll be okay with the Panasonic G9 up to 6400. I hope you find this video useful and informative. If you did, please like and subscribe, and we're gonna see you soon for some more content.